There's a great deal of change that has taken place at a very fast pace. And the communications of what people are seeing. When you go to work, you're doing your work and you're not dealing with the issues. And so you have something in common, perhaps. But when you're really dealing with the actual measures of what they say and how they vote or actions they take, and you plot those things, you put numbers to them and you plot those things, you could see what's happening. And it's not civil debate. I described how it used to be that both candidates would present their positions and what the country and people would consider that in the vote and how it's all different. Yes, it's very, very different. And you do the dot plot and you can see that. So yes, I think, do we have irreconcilable differences? I think that's the real question. If you hear a lot of these issues, we do, and people will move. They'll change location, not just because of taxes, but because of going to be with people whose values and their circumstances are more like them. And you're seeing that happen. And I think you'll see a big difference probably between the relationship of states and the federal government. I think more in the future, states' rights and controlled by power. Like the sanctuary city issue. When the federal government says you should do this and the state or local government says I'm not, then you have the breakdown of the system. They don't just go to a rule. Then you have a power-driven set of circumstances. And I think we're moving. We know it's more like that than it was. If you look at history, that's what I'm saying, I think is pretty clearly going on. I mean, why do they move from California to Texas? All the surveys show that large majority, really, you would take the population. There's a middle, but if you take those that have fundamentally big differences in terms of demonizing the other, say, I don't want to be with the other, those kinds of things, it represents something like 60% of the population. That's not made up. That is a reality. And you see that demonization in these patterns. And you see how it works with the media. So there's a dynamic that you see repeat over and over again. And the media, certainly true today, also likes to sensationalize and be on one side or the other and demonize. And so to find out what's true and to balance things, like what are the pros and cons, is not really common. It barely exists. And it's difficult. It's not easy to be in talking about the reasonableness and the issues of both sides and to try to deal with the merit of both sides. I guarantee you, like the history, the middle gets imprisoned or shot. Larry Summers described it to me. He said the average time horizon is 9 months in the future, roughly 9 months in the future. And then there's motivations. For example, giving people more, which means spending more, which means you can borrow and spend more. Nobody pays attention to whether that spending is coming from borrowing. Then leads to, I will be a more popular candidate if I borrow and spend more, and I will get elected, and then somewhere down the line, the other guy will deal with the debt. All of those things lend itself to short-termism. For example, not spending adequate money on education. There's hardly any better investment in terms of productivity. The return on investment for education is just enormous, plus it makes a fairer system, but there are structural reasons. And so there is a short-termism, of course, and that creates a cycle. Like if I borrow, I spend more, but then I have to pay back in the future, and that creates a cycle. And of course, when the time for paying back in the future comes, because that's painful, then they will print more money to make that easier, which will devalue the money. That's it. That's right. There's a cycle. I grew up in the United States. As far as I'm concerned, I would love to keep it exactly like it's been, right? In other words, the element of freedom, the flexibility of choice, the choice by the people, and so on. Sometimes they may not make the best choices, but they have the flexibility and it's in their interest. And if it works well, it's just such a fabulous system. And then what you see in the cycles, you just see the mechanics of the cycles. And it went back to Plato and his describing of the Republic. In a sense, what you have is a democracy, because democracy has existed, for thousands of years, really. And democracy, the big risk of democracy is anarchy. When you have bad conditions and people start fighting with each other, then there's the issue of who's going to get control of those places. And so you have the 1930 to 45 period, you had 4 democracies choose to be autocracies. Their parliaments chose it. That happened in Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain. They said, somebody get control of this. And so that disorder leads to the strong, Plato would say, that then you ideally have the benevolent despot who is sort of, okay, I'll take control, I'll make the trains run on time, and we'll take care of that. And then with time, you get the sort of the evil despot who is then operating that way, and nobody can sustain that. You always have to have the change. And so then you have the revolution again, and then you kind of keep on with the process. So there tends to be a cycle of those types of things, and we have to know our vulnerabilities. So to keep what we cherish, we have to behave well with each other, respect the rule of law, respect the Constitution, respect thoughtful disagreement, and work together. And then we have, what we ideally aspire to, I think. In fact, there are many, many cases. A great leader, you watch these arcs, will win the war, will then have to deal with the remaining opposition. So they have to consolidate power to go on their mission in some way or another. They have to bring about stopping the fighting internally. And then they build a system that starts to improve things. And you could see the arcs in the charts in the book because you could see, okay, education is the leading indicator. You start with education, you start with the system, and then you build that particular system. And then they also has to build a system that transitions well to the next leader, because no leaders last as long as a good empire or a good dynasty. So you have to have a transition of a system. And democracy in the United States has worked pretty damn well. We only had one civil war, but it requires the cherishing of it and the operating that way in order for that arc to continue. So I think you can see in these cases over and over again what's good, what's bad, and you can see the consequences. And yes, I think about the post-World War II period. What a wonderful period that was for the United States and the world, and also for Americans who had a middle class and they were in it together and they restructured things and they built things and they worked together, and then we have the cycle get overextended. So that's how it looks to me.